From Friday the 6th of June to Sunday the 8th of June 2014, the Green Foundation Ireland hosted a conference, a summer school, on the theme of greening the EU in the context of the Eurosceptic debate. In this, the final session, John Barry, Professor of Politics at Queen's and a Green Party councillor, and Benoit Luchat, Editor-in-Chief of the Green European Journal, explore ideas of democracy, identity, and the politics of non-violence.
It's to be called here the peace process in Northern Ireland, and what lessons that can hold for us in terms of other conflicts in Europe and beyond, or even in my case in particular about the transition from unsustainability, which is how I phrase what green politics is about. For those of you, Benoit has read some of my work. I don't like talking about sustainability and sustainable development because, a bit like I don't like talking about justice. We live in a profound situation of injustice. We live in a profound context of unsustainability, which I think is a different understanding of the problematic facing us. So anyway, we can talk about that in the Q&A. This is a visual representation of the issues here in Northern Ireland. And of course, this being Northern Ireland, we have multiple names for everything. So you can call it the North, the 6 counties, Ulster, although Ulster actually includes 3 other counties which are in the south. Or you can call it Northern Ireland.
North-Eastern Ireland.
Or North-Eastern Ireland as well. I think from a green perspective, green political perspective, I like to describe Northern Ireland as the place where the islands overlap. The place where the islands overlap. And it fits into some of the discussions we had yesterday in terms of Scottish independence, in terms of that reconfiguration of these islands that may come about as a result of Scotland going independent. Need not necessarily be the disaster that people, particularly from a unionist tradition in Northern Ireland, might think it is. But that's the context we're in. And many of you would know, even those not from the island of Ireland or John Bull's island across the way, the mainland, that's sometimes the mainland across the way, is that for 40 years we had, and again, it depends on your political perspective, it was either a war, a conflict, and of course in that wonderful way that we only have on this island, we call it the Troubles. It's a bit like in the Republic of Ireland we call the Second World War the emergency. We have this wonderful capacity to de-emphasise and de-escalate. So this is, euphemistically, it was called the Troubles, which existed, or some say they haven't finished, from about 1968-69 up until 1998, when we had the Good Friday, if you're nationalist, or the BELFAST, if you're a unionist agreement. We have, again, 2 names for everything. About 3,500 people were killed during the conflict. Many countless thousands more injured, and particularly because my wife works in the National Health Service as a clinical psychologist, the amount of mental trauma is quite staggering in Northern Ireland. We perhaps have the most pharmacised section of the population in Europe in terms of legal prescriptions for dealing with everything from post-traumatic stress disorder to other forms of psychological stress. And it's extremely gendered as well, by the way, which is something we might want to talk about, is that it was the women in Northern Ireland who kept society going, while often it was the men who were either involved in violence or in jail or on the run. But it's quite an interesting gender dimension that after the war, it's the women who suffer the trauma, and often the trauma goes back decades. And it's one of the curious features of peace coming to Northern Ireland is that some people report higher levels of mental distress since the conflict ended. It's almost like they're now allowing themselves the luxury of having a mental breakdown that they couldn't when the conflict was on. The other curious aspect is rather more negative, and this gets us into the issue of conflict transformation and management. We have more peace walls in Northern Ireland now since the agreement of 1998. We have more people choosing to live in single identity areas than we had during the conflict. It's a sad feature. I speak now both as a parent but also as a university professor. As a parent, My children go to a Steiner school, the Waldorf school, which for many years was the only integrated school in a wide vicinity. We have a small integrated sector of education. About 5% of our children are educated in integrated schools. 95% of our children are educated either in Catholic or what's sometimes called the state or maintained sector. So we either go to Catholic schools or Protestant schools, basically. And it means for me as a university professor, when I'm teaching first-year students, sometimes it may be the first time that a Catholic may have sat beside a Protestant in an educational context. So we have a system that you could describe as not quite as malign as the South African situation, but we live in a profoundly divided society, aspects of which you could describe as apartheid in terms of certainly education, but also then in terms of sports, language. Just give you an example again, my own personal experience. My accent, for many of you from Europe, you wouldn't know any different, but it marks me out. My children's names are Irish names, Saoirse and Dervla. That marks them out in terms of, we have a wonderful capacity, certainly in Northern Ireland. We do this gentle dance around what we call, what foot do you dig with? Which community are you from? Catholic, Protestant, nationalist and unionist. And it usually begins by, the accent gives me out straight away. But if it's not the accent, the name. So you've got an Irish name, well that's an indication maybe you're Catholic and you're an Irish nationalist. But then we ask things like, what school did you go to? So there's a whole series of gentle ways of probing that have developed here over, you could say, centuries. I mean, the issue here is not just that in 1968 people woke up and said, you know what, I don't like you, and they just started shooting and killing each other. This is a much deeper process, which we may get into in the Q&A. So this is just an example of how linguistically, even using the English language, we have so many ways in which we divide in terms of how we describe this place. The classic one, Derry, Londonderry, or Stroke City. They call it Stroke City because London stroke Londonderry. And in fact, if you drive or get the bus from Belfast to Derry, Londonderry, you'd see at various parts on the way, the road signs would be defaced. So you'd come to a part and the London will be scratched out, and then you may come up with London's been scratched out and then repainted back in. So all of these markings of territory, which for some of you who walked around Belfast would have seen as well, in terms of the flags, the curbstones being painted, in terms of marking territory of us and them. And in fact, it's a major part of the dynamic in Northern Ireland. This is an issue I think is also true of other conflicts, of that binary opposition as being very debilitating and counterproductive. In terms of, you constitute your identity by you're not them. And this is the issue of the other. Whether that by class, by colour of your skin, by religion, by ethnicity. Many of the problems that we have in terms of political unrest have to do with this, the constant demand, it seems, particularly within certain forms of nationalism, of othering. So we have to have an other against which we define ourselves, and of course Northern Ireland is a classic example of that. So what we have in Northern Ireland in terms of some of the lessons is we have this process of moving from conflict and war to a process now where we're still not completely at peace. We have a peace process. In fact, much of our institutional arrangements are the outworkings of a peace process in terms of consociationalism, a wonderful Dutch invention of, where we have certain pillars of division within society. Society is still divided, but the consociational model is where the political elites can negotiate with each other. And that's effectively what we have. And that can work up to a point. And that's the issue that I would like to see us having a discussion around, is that you have to begin to have grassroots integration. And it's not enough. It may be necessary but not sufficient for elites to bargain and do a deal. But actually, you have to take the people as well. And in fact, the consociational model we have in Northern Ireland could be described as an example of high fences make good neighbours. High fences make good neighbours. So it's kind of a reinforcing of a benign apartheid. So we're not killing and bombing and shooting each other, but we don't quite trust one another. And it's one of the curious aspects of the Northern Ireland conflict is that the two communities, we never hated each other enough for all-out genocide, which you'd find in places like Rwanda. So there was never that impetus for all-out genocide. So the levels of disquiet, suspicion, hatred were never at that tipping point that we've seen in other parts of the world. It's also the case, although it's not a morally elegant thing to say in some ways, is that more people were probably killed in Rwanda in one day than were killed in the entire 40 years in Northern Ireland. In other words, to get in terms of perspective, in terms of the actual number of people killed, that's not to take or diminish the hurt and the pain and the absolutely appalling loss of life of so many people over so many years. But what Northern Ireland teaches us, or my interpretation, is that lesson from Churchill, jaw is better than war, is that eventually the various parties, and in particular Irish Republicans, those who were supporting the IRA in their terrorist campaign, of course, there we enter the other issue, one person's terrorist, another person's freedom fighter, and so on. But the IRA realised they essentially couldn't beat the British Army. The British Army realised they couldn't defeat the IRA. There was an incredible sense of moral and, if you like, almost even physical tiredness of the people just fed up. We've had so many years of killing and mayhem. And of course, that's the essence of terrorism. It's not about the actual infliction of pain and death and destruction. It's the threat. And that the psychological damage that can do, to pick up on a term that we used, I don't know which session, of insecurity. That incredible atmosphere of insecurity that was created by terrorism cannot be underestimated, except for those who've lived through it. It just constantly wears you down. And it cauterizes you morally, I think, the longer it goes on. For those of us who are from the Republic of Ireland, very quickly, even as a child, that's all we got on the news was, another bomb, another killing. And after a while, it blurs. It's a bit like, Stalin was supposed to have said, you kill one person, it's a murder. Kill a couple of million, it's a statistic. And in a way, that constant drip feeding for decades, I think there is a morally cauterizing aspect. You become desensitized to it, which again can't be overestimated. But essentially what we got in the late 1990s was eventually the various parties, particularly Sinn Féin, who were the political wing of the IRA, entered negotiations with the British government. The Irish government was involved as well. There was support from America, so there was a very strong international dimension. And eventually, a peace process was cobbled together in this consociational power-sharing model. And so that meant there had to be compromise. So, for example, and it's always been one of the curious aspects of why my unionist colleagues on council never take my advice, is I constantly say to them, I said, you unionists are too stupid to realise you won. You won. The agreement of 1998 was a defeat of militarist Irish nationalism, because now you have a situation of Sinn Féin, the party of Irish Republicanism, administering British government in this part of Ireland. You won, you idiots. So why are you so insecure? Republicans, on the other hand, were too smart to realise they lost. And it's one of the aspects, one of the enduring images I couldn't find it to show you, is that when the agreement was signed, it was with a kind of sullen acceptance on the unionist side. Because it wasn't enthusiastically, because it was put to a referendum to the people in both parts of Ireland, and with enthusiastic support down south, enthusiastic support from the Catholic community here, and less enthusiastic, but still a majority of the Protestant Unionist population. But the image that sticks in my mind of when that happened, it was in April 1998, was in West Belfast, which is kind of the heartland, both physically and indeed even psychologically, of Irish republicanism in Northern Ireland, of taxis with Irish tricolors going up and down the street celebrating the agreement, whereas actually my interpretation of it was a defeat of what the IRA had been doing for 40 years to try and bomb their way into a united Ireland. Hadn't worked, but it was celebrated as a great victory. And that therein lies one of the importance of image and spin and branding being often more important than the substance of actually what was going on. And partly what I think the agreement tells us is that ultimately what unites becomes much more important than what divides. And what united people and the various antagonistic relationships was a desire for no more war, the absence of war. And this is where we get into my pointy head, to use Alex Wardylac's of an academic. Thomas Hobbes, the wonderful English philosopher during the Civil War in England. We do wars great in these islands, always wars, always fighting and so on. Thomas Hobbes said, peace is not the absence of war, it's the absence of the threat of war. And what we have now, we've moved from war, but we're still not quite to the stage of the absence of the threat, because we still have ongoing political killings, British Army soldiers being killed, police officers being shot at, prison officers being shot at and killed. So it's a much lower level than it was prior to 1998, but we do still have a small minority, particularly in Irish republicanism, because this is always the tradition in Ireland where you get splits. It's the first item, as Brendan Behan said, of any Irish political party, the split is the first item on the agenda. So you've had a splintering in the Irish Republican movement where the mainstream have gone with Sinn Féin into the peace process, but there's still a small number of what we call dissidents who are still continuing this armed struggle for the united Ireland. And this is the last bit that I think really is important for me in terms of the Northern Ireland story, and indeed it fits with the transition from unsustainability and why I think conflict resolution and the conflict management are important aspects for us as Greens or those interested in moving away from a debt-based consumer carbon fuel capitalism. There's a lot of C's for you. Carbon fuel capitalism. How do we move from that? I think this issue of how in Northern Ireland we move from a position of seeing each other as enemies to now seeing each other as opponents. And I think sometimes we have to measure progress by how less bad it is rather than how much better it is. You know, we'd all be familiar with that phrase, never let the perfect become the enemy of the good. That's the lesson of Northern Ireland. Make things less bad. And we cannot underestimate, again, I think it was Tommy Simpson who mentioned in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of need, what's the very bottom, the foundation? Security. To feel a sense of you're secure in your place in society and bodily integrity. I mean, these things most of us take for granted. Whereas for many people in this city, in times gone past, you did not know whether or not you're going to come back that evening. Because it was bombs. That's why we have a curious architecture in the city. You'll see a beautiful 19th century red brick building, and then suddenly you'll see, a very recent concrete. That's because the one that's concrete has been blown up at some point. The Europa Hotel used to have the unenviable title as the most bombed hotel in Europe. The Crown Bar at one stage, which is across, didn't even bother putting in new windows. Because he said, well, in a few weeks' time there's going to be another bomb, so let's keep the boards up and so on. So I think this issue in Northern Ireland, for me, the positive aspect is this movement from seeing each other, former enemies, into seeing each other as opponents. And I would much rather see, for example, what goes on, and I speak now as a political science lecturer, if you ever look at the debates in the Australian Parliament, they are wonderfully entertaining because they use much more unparliamentary language. I mean, Paul Gogarty would have fitted in perfectly in Australia, where they can tear strips off each other even use bad language, which they have a lot more latitude to do, which I think is very healthy. I'd rather see people jaw. Jaw does not mean you all sit down and be nice to each other and agree. You can shout and scream so long as you do not transgress this one issue. And my good friend Maurice McCartney here has given me a lot of ideas on this. The one thing you don't want to do is get and transgress past the thresholds of violence. So the new threshold is not us and them. It becomes the threshold of violence and non-violence. So here's the thing. As I say to my unionist colleagues on council, but they never listen to me, as you probably get the pattern now. I say there's absolutely nothing wrong in being a proud Irish Republican in Northern Ireland and wishing fervently, with every fibre of your body, for the reunification of this island. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. What is wrong is when that then becomes a justification for killing, for threatening, for engaging in violence, or at least the preconditions of violence. Equally, to Republicans, I say, there's absolutely nothing wrong with feeling proudly British and wanting to maintain your link with the United Kingdom, but still, again, so long as you don't transgress into violence. Or indeed, being neither British or Irish in those simplistic sense, but something quite different, which is where I come in, this hybridity in terms of identities, and not having to be forced into one or two of those other things. And that's one of the downsides of our current peace process, is that you are forced, as Stephen Agnew, our Green MLA, you have three categories that you have to sign up to as a politician in our assembly. You're either unionist or nationalist or other. And according to the agreement and the way it works, your vote as other does not count. So when it comes to an issue of cross-party, cross-community agreement, being an other does not count. So you're forced to be either nationalist or unionist. And I have to say, the Green Party here in Northern Ireland, we're the only party whereby we have no predetermined... So Stephen did not have to necessarily designate as other. We made an agreement within the party many years ago that any MLA or MLAs, let's be positive, MLAs being elected, that's a member of the Legislative Assembly, could decide in agreement with the party to designate whichever is going to help increase their political influence. So I would have loved, with my thick Dublin accent, to be elected as a Green MLA and designate as unionist, if that was to help us get more political support to do. And I think that sense of fluidity, that's a political strategic decision, but it also reflects, I think, the underlying, Green perspective on Northern Ireland as a place where these islands overlap, to allow a more multiplicity of identities and hybridity than perhaps is given by this us-them dynamic. So this is an example, I'm just using visually here, of our progress. For God and Ulster to for Cod and Ulster. And the way, there's also some issues here which I'll just throw out, is that you can see this as a cipher or a symbol of a bourgeois, liberal, consumer society. And for many people, South Belfast represents the café chic outcome of the peace process, where we've moved from a situation of war into a more normal, whatever normal is, European liberal democratic society, often expressed in entry into consumerism, the market, and so on. And for some people, again, it's another curious aspect which to me was interesting in talking to former serving policemen and women, for example, some of whom expressed a profound disappointment with the peace process and what's happened since 1990. I said, what do you mean? Well, how can you not like the fact that you're not going to be shot at and so on? And I said, you're missing the overtime. It's me, thinking in terms of just the money that people were getting paid more because of the conflict. And they said, no, is that their lives have less meaning now. That whatever about the conflict, and we have reports certainly in Britain from the mass observation studies of the Second World War, where many people reported higher levels in the context of being bombed and their sons, their uncles, their husbands going off to fight. Many people who were left, who were actually also doing the fighting as well, but also those who were left at home in Britain, felt higher levels of personal satisfaction in the context of a war. That had to do with things like solidarity, the sense of a common purpose, class differences, gender differences, even there's some evidence of even racial differences diminishing during the Second World War in Britain as a result of this common cause and a heightened sense of commonality and meaning-making in the context of war. And that we have evidence of that here in Northern Ireland. But I'm not going to make too much of it, but it was, for me, as an interesting dimension that people could miss conflict. And on the other side, if you move from policemen and women to paramilitaries, they also report, well, what's their status now? You've got the tattoos, you've got, you're a big person in your community because you fought for the cause, whether that cause was United Ireland or United Kingdom. Where do they fit in? And we have a major issue here of the reintegration of former combatants, which you find is common in other peace processes around the world. I would say there is a particular difference between the Republican nationalist community, on the Catholic side, and the loyalist unionist, or the Protestant side, is that there's a much easier and ready capacity within the nationalist community to reintegrate and indeed promote. I mean, Martin McGuinness, who's the second most highest politician in Northern Ireland, is a former IRA commander. At least unlike Gerry Adams, he had the decency to admit the fact that he was in the IRA. So this is a former paramilitary, a terrorist, depending on your views, who is now our second most powerful political leader. I find that difficult to have an equivalence in the unionist, loyalist community. As an issue there, it's more of a local issue. Why is it that one side of the community here in Northern Ireland that was, involved in supporting, or aspects of that community supporting conflict, finds it much easier to integrate those former combatants in a way that the other community doesn't? And it's part of the difficulty we have with things like the flags protests, orange parades, other cultural expressions and so on, which we may pick up again in the Q&A. So what's all this got to do with sustainability or unsustainability? And I think for many of us, we have people in the room, whether it's John Gormley at the back or Stefan, Nuthi, Nuala, politicians, former ministers in positions of power at various points in the Green Party's history would, I think, readily recognise this, that Green politics, as a radical politics, radical in the sense of the Latin word of radial, getting to the root, that's what makes Green politics, I think, unique. We're not interested just in dealing with the effects, but what's the causes of the many unsustainability problems we face. And getting to the cause and rectifying those is an exercise in conflict management. It's identifying that we're not going to bring everybody with us. It's an exercise in realising a very powerful interest range against us in terms of where's fracking come from. It kind of nearly out of nowhere in the last number of years to completely change the energy debate. The banking interests, which I think are now on the progressives' agenda in a way that they weren't before. These very powerful interests against the transition from unsustainability is also part of what I'm gesturing towards. But also the more mundane one, where people of good faith can disagree. It isn't, many of you know my political trajectory. I used to be in a far left group called the Workers' Party, and I was a rabid Marxist. I'm still a Marxist, but not so rabid now, I think. And it was so much easier to have that simplistic view of the world where there's a bunch of capitalist bastards and they were just wrecking the everything. Almost like a James Bond villain stroking a cat. Yes, let's create global inequality and climate change and so on. And it's a wonderfully simplistic and very appealing way of looking at the world. I no longer believe that. I'm now of the view that when you point your finger at somebody, there's three back at you. And that the division is not between us and them, but the division's in ourselves. So in other words, when I'm talking about conflict management, it's not that, it's demons over there. We've got a lot of that, we call it whataboutery. What about demons? It's they're causing the problem. The division within unsustainability is as much a psychological division in the self as it is a division between capitalists or pro-fracking and those supporting renewable energy. We're all conflicted on this issue. And I think we need to, many of us recognise, we don't often publicly talk about it, that we're all conflicted on this issue. So conflict management is partly it's internal as much as it is an external expression. And to me, just to finish up, it's the reasons why I think a green perception of the transition from unsustainability has to be an exercise in conflict management in a democratic process. I am of the view, and have been for many years, certainly since living in Northern Ireland since 2000, as I have done, is that democracy is non-violent disagreement. I think it's a much more realistic, it's not the only, you can have democracy as agreement and consensus, but actually democracy as non-violent disagreement, I think, can be a very healthy way of this transition from enemy to opponent in terms of how can we find a way of measuring, of respecting our differences. And I would say here that Northern Ireland, and it's part of our journey, we still suffer, and I know it's not unique to Northern Ireland, but it's the one I've got most experience of, we suffer from ungenerous majorities. That's why I think the work of Peter Emerson, in terms of that majoritarian view of democracy, can also be seen in, for example, the flags protest, which many of you have seen around the world. What happened there was that two nationalist parties, Sinn Féin and the SDLP, and the Alliance Party and the Centre Party, holding the balance of power, they made a democratic decision to take down the flag, or at least remove it from being flown 365 days a year to now only being flown on certain designated days. But to me, and again, when I talking to Sinn Féin politicians and activists or SDLP, I say, why did you do that? Why were you an ungenerous majority when you know how important that flag is? You may not like it or respect it. This is part constitutionally of the United Kingdom. For that community, this is a very important symbol because, you know, even though Northern Ireland makes up about 2% of the entire UK population, in certain British Army regiments, the Northern Irish contingent can be as high as 20%. So there's a long tradition of military service here in Northern Ireland, as well as, of course, that sense of a certain sense of British identity being tied up with the Union flag. So for me, and the Green Party's position, we had our conference last year where we decided that our policy on the flag flying would be designated days. But we would, where possible, also push to increase beyond designated days. Because between designated days and 365 is a big figure. So what's wrong with saying, you know, we're going to fly 200 days a year? We don't have to. It's not legally binding. We only have to fly 20 days a year legally. But there's nothing stopping a generous majority saying, I'm going to fly it more because it means so much to you. So it's in part the conflict now in Northern Ireland is about emblems, flags, cultural expressions and the past. The real battle for Sinn Féin in particular is about justifying the conflict in terms of who owns the past. Now I think that's much healthier than actual conflict. Again, it's this transition from enemy to opponent, from antagonism to what I call, my point the academic had, agonism. So this idea of this conflict transformation is about how do we make things less bad. We do not live in a completely peaceful society in Northern Ireland, but we argue furiously about parades, orange parades every year, that sometimes transgress into violence, but actually it's only a small, tiny proportion of the parades that actually are contentious. We still argue about the past. That's much more healthy than the conflict we experienced for 40 years of actual violence and killing. And I think disagreement is inevitable in terms of, well, that's what democracy is. It's about pluralism, variety, differences. How do we actually see these playing out? And therefore I do think that, and this is partly based on some research I did on why people object to wind farms, particularly in Northern Ireland, is that you do not dismiss them as NIMBYs, you do not deny them a voice, that actually the inclusion of even objectors is a much more healthy way of getting to a better resolution. So in other words, many people, when I promote enthusiastically wind energy and so on, and I was of the view, these annoying bourgeois people interested only in the price of their houses and so on, that somehow we pigeonhole those who object against wind as irrational, selfish, holding back the transition to a low-carbon society. And there may be elements of that, but actually a much healthier way is the inclusion and the respectful listening to their concerns. Because many people often objected against wind energy, certainly in Northern Ireland, because of a perceived procedural injustice. They felt the system was reigned against them. Because essentially we have a pro-developer planning system, and Dean will back me up on this, and that includes even wind energy, where people feel that their rights are not being respected. There's been ridden roughshod over and so on. So this idea of including objectors or those who we disagree with is an essential part of democracy, and indeed I think it's an essential part of community and solidarity. This is a non-romantic version of community. Community is about getting on with people that you may not necessarily like. We often think, we need to be people who eulogise about community and so on, as if we're a great big happy family. Even families disagree. And I think we need to get real that the sense of solidarity and community and common cause we can make with each other is not necessarily based on us always liking each other. But it is about not disliking to the extent that, again, we transgress into violence or threat. I think that's a much healthier way of understanding community and democracy, is in terms of respecting difference and indeed not having a romantic view that we always agree. But then I think what's happening in Northern Ireland, again, I think it can be expanded to other parts of the world, is that not only is democracy a decision-making procedure, so we don't know the outcome of it, unless you live in North Korea or the Soviet Union, where Peter gave some examples of referenda that supposedly democratic and you get the outcome that you want. So it's a decision-making procedure, which means you don't know the outcome of it. So you cannot, and that's always been a tension, a creative tension within certainly academic discussions of sustainability, is what if people democratically vote for unsustainability? And there's often been a debate in green political, certainly academic circles, about an authoritarian solution to sustainability problems. Maybe China is a better example of the transition to sustainability than a Western liberal democracy. I disagree, and I can go into the reasons for that. But it's a creative tension that democracy stands as a procedure that you don't know the outcome of. Sustainability is a substantive commitment to live in a different type of society. So the issue then is, how do you use democracy as a procedure to get to a substantive outcome? And I think you can. It's by greater democracy. I think where Greens have a problem with democracy, it's with liberal representative democracy, not with citizen-based, participative, deliberative forms of democracy. And indeed, it's always been the reason why we're so proud to be a Green, is that our passion for democracy is, why should democracy end at the classroom door, the factory gate? Why is it that we don't see democracy, which we accept as an appropriate way to govern our polity, our political life, yet for most of our lives, in the world of work in particular, we live in completely authoritarian systems. Very hierarchical command and control, with very little autonomy or rights of participation. So I think we as Greens have an argument for the full spectrum democratisation of many parts of our lives. But of course, that Oscar Wilde proviso of why socialism would take up too many evenings. Now, there's a limit as well, practical limits in terms of what we can do. But there is something around that idea of the Green commitment to democracy is really commitment to democratisation of many parts of our lives, in the economy, even indeed in innovation and technology, and certainly more in our community and so on. And that is what I'm getting at, is that democracy is not just a decision-making procedure, it is a culture. A culture of respect, a culture built on equality, because one of the one-sentence definitions of democracy is that each to count for one, none for more than one. Everybody is fundamentally equal in a democracy, which is why capitalism is always going to threaten democracy, because it is an inequality-producing system. So how can we equate the fundamental democratic equality with the massive socioeconomic wealth, income inequalities that capitalism and a economic growth system that it's based upon produces? And in many respects, with a more historical bent, it's the reason why I always suggest that the Industrial Revolution will always threaten the French Revolution. What I mean by that is the Industrial Revolution is the transformation in our productive sphere going back to the 18th century, which then, the capitalist industrialism. The French Revolution I view as the first upsurgings of democracy. So it's where democracy and capitalism, I think, are always going to be in conflict. So there's an issue there in terms of the transition from unsustainability. But also, finally, then, democracy as a culture, as a way of disagreeing, it humanizes and it reduces this fear of the other. Because I think insecurity and fear go together, which is what I worry about in Northern Ireland, where when I have a first-year lecture of 200 students, this is the first time they sat beside each other. And there's a fear, because you then exaggerate and stereotype the other. This is an inevitable consequence of not having sufficient contact on the basis of equality. You think all Protestants are bowler-hatted, orange-wearing bigots. You think every Irish Republican is a bomb-carrying provo. Now, I'm exaggerating for the sake of exaggeration. Again, it's when the truth loses its temper. That's what exaggeration is. But these are the mindsets that often people carry around when they don't have regularised contact with one another on the basis of respect and equality. And again, I'm not romanticising this and saying that we're going to see and be won over and begin to like the other person. You don't have to like them. That may come. A democracy is not built on friendship so much as bonds of solidarity and of respect. And I think we often confuse that somehow we have to all get on and like each other. We don't. That may come about, and that'd be nice if it did happen, but it's not a necessary condition for a functioning democracy. So here endeth the secular sermon. Thanks for listening.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me here in Belfast, because it's really the way we are building Europe by transnationalizing and exchanging experiences. And I'm also very impressed and honored to speak after John, because John is for me one of the major authors nowadays in political ecology. I only recommend to read his book, The Politics of Actually Existing Unsustainability. It's a long title, but it's a good book.
For a short, long title for a short man.
Yeah. And I hope that we will have the opportunity in the future to invite you on the continent and to discuss your book with other Greens from Germany, from France, and from Belgium. So I want to speak now and give some remarks on a few points, a bit in the disorder, remarks on history, violence, memory, democracy, federalism, and ecology. So there are a lot of convergences between what you said and what I want to say in my broken English. So on my way to Belfast, I read some articles prepared by a colleague of Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the foundation of the Walloon Belgian Greens, and he knows very well Northern Ireland, far better than I know. Until then, my knowledge of its history was quite narrow, except some TV pictures from my childhood, picture of bombings and violent demonstrations, and more recently, pictures of the movie Bloody Sunday, where British paratroopers were shooting on people demonstrating peacefully with guns that had been produced not far away of my hometown in Belgium, in Liège. FN guns. What I read has deeply impressed me, as I was fully unaware of the amount of people that are still suffering from the consequences of these so-called troubles. I read an article written by Catherine Stone, who, as she says, has the painful privilege to be the victims commissioner in Northern Ireland. What impressed me in this article was that the amount of victims and survivors of the conflict equates approximately 500,000 people. This is much more, of course, than the 3,500 deaths that you mentioned. This goes far beyond, and this gives us an idea of the depth of this conflict. And the second thing that has drawn my attention was the title of the article. Dealing with the past, there must never be a hierarchy of the pain. I want to explain now why this second point, the title of this article, has immediately drawn my attention. In the last months, as editor of the Green European Journal, I was involved in a project that was proposed by my Dutch colleague Erika Meyer, who is the editor-in-chief of the Green Journal, The Helling, in the Netherlands. I was involved in a project on the First World War. We have been gathering numerous articles from different countries on their relationship towards the First World War. She asked me to write the history of my grandfather, and this was a very important moment for me because it brought me back in the history of my own family and in the transfer of the fears and of the traumas from the First World War. When I was preparing this article, I've also seen two fascinating films that have been made, two fascinating movies, that have been filmed recently in Belgium on the German atrocities that were committed in August 1914 in Belgium. In Belgium, nowadays, a huge majority of Belgians do not know that in the first 2 months of the war, the German army killed more Belgian civilians than Belgian soldiers. So around between 5,000 and 6,000 people were shot. They were falsely accused to be snipers, but this was really the dramatic entry in the massive and total wars of the 20th century. And this happened in Belgium. And nowadays, apart from the population of these villages and of these small towns like Dinan, for example, nearly nobody knows that in Belgium. In the film, there was an interview of a Belgian political scientist, an academic. Her name is Valérie Rozou, who is working on reconciliation and memory processes. And this is really interesting because she explained there that during her research in the archives, she suddenly discovered that part of her family was shot in Dinan during these atrocities of 14. This discovery freed her from the horrible nightmares that she had until then. And she also understood why she had made the choice to work on the issue of memory and reconciliation. So 100 years after. And she says somewhere in the film, 4 generations for the victims is like 4 days. The Belgians had to wait until 1945 before the German state recognized the full responsibility of the German army in the atrocities and gave up the thesis of the snipers. The Belgian civilians are not shot on the German soldiers, and they admitted that the murders were also the consequence of a sort of Darwinist ideology for which the Belgians were second-class people. And there was perfect for me. This is a major discovery, and this is also the merit of a book written by 2 excellent Irish historians, John Horn and Paul Kramer of Trinity College, The German Atrocities in Belgium. This is really the merit to show the continuity between the First World War and the Second World War in the ideological aspects. So there was a recognition by the German authorities after the Second World War, but the memory of the atrocities of August 14 was also somehow hidden by the millions of victims of the total wars and of the Holocaust. And this is more than logical. Until now, these victims are still waiting for a full recognition. What I learned from this story is, first, for the victims, like Catherine Stokes says, the past is your present and will profoundly affect your future too. The second thing, you can only reconcile people and nations on the basis of justice. Only the Tribunal of Nuremberg made a reconciliation between Belgium and Germany possible. Third, we must accept that for some descendants, this reconciliation is not always possible. I quote an old lady in the film that I saw on the Atrocities in Dinan. She didn't like to see the German flag hanging on the bridge over the Meuse. For her, it was still a sort of betrayal for her grandmother, who was murdered 100 years ago. But for others, reconciliation, and this is the good news, is perfectly possible. And they were full of gratitude for the forgiveness that was asked by the German government in Dinan 10 years ago or so. On my way to Belfast, I was also thinking about my professor of philosophy in the University of Louvain, Jean Ladrière, who wrote a small text after the decolonization of Congo, where many Belgian colonists were killed. He wrote something like that. I don't find the exact quote, but I remember it. The tragedy of the human existence is that we do not meet only as individuals, but that we also, first and foremost, meet as belonging to collective identities, and that this fact is a major cause of violence between human beings. This brings me to democracy, federalism, and political ecology. For explaining my conception of democracy, and this is really close to your cultural explanation of democracy, I would like to quote another author, and it's the sociologist Alain Caillé. He gives the definition of democracy as not only the government of the people by the people, but also the art of opposing to each other without murdering to each other. L'art de s'opposer sans se massacrer. And this brings me to federalism and ecology. My party, Ecolo, like many other green parties, has always been committed to the federalist idea and to the European construction project. It's not only because of the dimension of the size of the environmental problems that can be best addressed on a supranational level. It is also because the pioneers of the European Green Movement in the 70s had been deeply influenced by a philosophical trend called personalism. Personalism was an attempt to find an alternative to the lonely individualism of liberalism and to the collectivism of Marxism. For these authors of the 30s already, before the Second War, the person is characterized by the fact that he or she can combine different identities in the same human being. And the role of politics is to ensure that these identities can coexist peacefully in different institutions. For the personalists and for the first Greens, the decentralized level of the municipality, of the local community, was the most important. Of course, they believed a bit naively that decentralizing would automatically ensure sustainability. This federalist commitment was the base of the support of Ecolo to all institutional reforms that were voted in Belgium since the beginning of the 90s. We took part to these reforms. We were very committed in order to ensure peace in Belgium, and this was not an easy task. It was not always very popular. But these reforms have succeeded in solving peacefully the conflicts between the Flemish and the French-speaking people. But we are still on the edge of separatism, even though I do not think it will ever happen. I don't believe in the end of Belgium. We are going endlessly, I don't know, infiniment endlessly to the end of Belgium. This is the story of my country. The Belgian federalism is a separation federalism. It's also a consociative democracy. It is another common point with you. Most of the solutions that have been implemented in the last decades allow the regions to decide for themselves how they manage their policies on more and more fields. But for me, federalism is not only the application of subsidiarity principle. It's also about bringing people with different identities to work together and to discuss democratically together. In Belgium nowadays, we are still missing a single constituency for all the country. Federal politicians are only elected on regional level. So it is a strong incentive for the subnationalism of the Flemish or of the Walloon parties. We have this problem mainly because we are really lacking a Belgian democratic public space where we can develop a common vision on a common Belgian interest. We are also lacking referenda. That's a big difference between us. There was never a referendum on all these reforms. And the fear of disagreements was too big between the politicians to dare the referendum. And this is a major problem of legitimacy, of course, even though I can understand that there are risks with a referendum, and the European Union knows that very well. To conclude, why am I a federalist, and why is it important for Greens to be federalists? First, and this would require more developments, but I will not. I will keep time for the debate. For me, it is crucial to understand that shared sovereignty reinforces the sovereignty. Sharing sovereignty is really crucial in any federal process, and this is maybe one of the major difficulties that the French Republic has with the European construction process, is to share the sovereignty. And you see also the return of nationalism everywhere in Europe, of people who do not want to share their sovereignty with others, although it's absolutely necessary to share sovereignty. Second, of course, I am for more subsidiarity, for more empowerment of local communities, resilient local communities that will be, for example, able to face the ecological crisis. You mentioned that. But I am also quite afraid of the dangers of closed local communities. For me, we need a welfare state. Of course, we need a green welfare state that allow the people to be independent of their community and, for example, to be free to leave their community and to go in another community or to live outside of the community. I fear the potentially authoritarian trends of some green approaches of community. So, and to conclude, if we do not interconnect these communities with broader institutions like the European Union, if we do not develop larger levels of solidarity, for example, with a European beginning of social security, we will always be exposed to all kinds of conflicts between individuals and communities and between nation states. And the past could come back in a completely different way, but it could come back, and we have learned also from the past that it takes time, and it takes too much time, but it's a reality, yes, to deal with the past for people who have been suffering of conflicts. So, to conclude, I just want to stress this issue of social and democratic innovation for the future of European Union. I think we really need to combine a reflection of the future of the European Union with a reflection on supporting democratic innovation. This will be the next edition of the Green European Journal. This will be our next issue. And I want to mention in this context an article on Olivier de Scutter. Is the special reporter for the hunger of the United Nations, and he has written a very comprehensive report on social and democratic innovation as a key project for the European Union for the future, for the next 5 years. So there is a lot of things to do. There are a lot of things to do. There are a lot of things to discuss. But the good thing is that we are maybe in a tipping point, historically seen, where new concept can move forward. Thank you for attention.
The tour, we can stay on after 12. Peter.
In 1988, August 1988, I was in Moscow. And this was the first ethnic conflict in the Soviet Union, as it still was. It was in Nagorno-Karabakh. Okay. And I went to buy my copy of Pravda the next morning, and the headline was Vot Nash Ulster. This is our Northern Ireland. I think it's probably fair to say that nobody in Northern Ireland knew what Nagorno-Karabakh was, let alone where or anything about it. But they understood. And similar in the Balkans. You just mentioned Northern Ireland. Okay, yeah, they understood. And there are huge similarities between the conflict here and conflicts there. And I would describe the Northern Ireland conflict, and I know it's difficult for those who have suffered but as a result of the Troubles, but the Northern Ireland conflict is probably the simplest I didn't like this word ethnic, but it's probably the simplest intercommunal conflict on the planet. And this is not because we're Irish or British or whatever, it's because Ireland, as we all know, is right on the edge of the Eurasian landmass, and so, I mean, there was the British Empire that sort of was here for a bit, and still is, but that was it. Whereas if you look at the Balkans, just in the last century, the Austro-Hungarians, the Ottomans, and then the Germans, and then the Italians, and then the Russians, and the British twice, and what a history, amazing history. And then you come to the majoritarianism nonsense. We had a Bosnian here in 1991, one of the conferences that we did in trying to overcome this majoritarian nonsense. And basically, as I said yesterday, the wars in Yugoslavia started with a referendum, and what happened in the Caucasus is that they had the war first, and then you have the referendum afterwards, by which time the minority is dead or exiled or something. But we had a Bosnian here in 91, October 91, 6 months before the war in Bosnia. And we tried to say, for God's sake, don't hold a referendum in Bosnia, of all places, because it was 40, 30, 20. There was no majority anyway. It was a crazy thing to do. And we used that conference. I mean, we had Sinn Féin and Unionists and all that sort of thing, and it's still before the ceasefire. And so it was an achievement even in that respect, actually. But the fact that we used multi-option voting to get a consensus, we did it in 86, was the first one, and we've done it since. And in 91, we're using electronic voting. Not bad for 1991. And yet, when the peace process happened, and in those conferences, we had future MLAs, TDs, MEPs, and one future president, Michael D. So lots of people had been looking. We had a few academics coming along to have a look at it as well. And we had journalists, and it's quite difficult to get a journalist to come on a Saturday and to attend a conference all day unless you ask them, would you like to be chair? And then you've got them for the day. Despite all of that, in the peace processes itself, all the talks, there was not one mention of multi-option voting. And they just went to the consociationalism, and it had been decided, Opsal, and amongst others, that was the system they were going to use, and any other talk of any other way of doing things was just not even on the agenda, and I still don't know why not.
John and Lula.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I understand Benoit when he says that sharing sovereignty reinforces sovereignty. I can understand that, for example, in the current situation, if the member states of the European Union shared their sovereignty over the area of banking and so forth, that this would create a method of democratic participation which would replace, or hopefully to some extent at any rate, replace the domination by the forces of finance which are not responsible to anybody. But surely it would not reinforce, you could not say that it would reinforce Irish sovereignty or French sovereignty or Belgian sovereignty. I don't understand, maybe I'm not understanding you correctly.
There is for sure a certain ambivalence, but I think that on climate change issue, it's sure that sharing sovereignty on the European level reinforces the weight of each separate country in the climate change in the climate negotiations. For example, if you share your sovereignty, what is the weight of Ireland, of Belgium, of France in the climate discussions? If we share that on the European level, we have a stronger sovereignty in the international negotiations.
Yes, it shares. It extends our personal sovereignty, not
the national sovereignty.
Okay,
Of course. Okay, this was not clear enough. I'm sorry.
I'm going to take a couple of groups of questions. So John and Nuala.
Okay. Well, first a comment and then a question to both of you. Thank you both for two very interesting talks. First of all, the comment. I mentioned Hugh Smith last night, and it was very interesting in the context of what you were saying about the tattoos on the arms and people fitting in. 20 years ago, he invited me. I was Lord Mayor of Dublin. He was Lord Mayor of Belfast. Invited me up to Belfast to the PUP mayor. Quite a, I suppose, generous gesture at the time and very far-reaching. But in his parlour, he had all his mates from his own community, and he mentioned all the tattoos up the arms. And immediately, one of them said, "You're very welcome to our country." So I kind of knew immediately the context in which it was meant. But this is the interesting point that you mentioned, John. Is why do we not have an equivalence? Why is it that we have Martin McGuinness in that position, and yet, despite the fact that we have Billy Hutchison and David Irwine and even Hughie Smith, nobody, right? And I'd like you to put on your Marxist hat for a moment now and just talk about class, because in my view, this has to do with class, right? The PUP never managed, in my view, to appeal to the Protestant middle class, right? They never broke out of that. Whereas, if you look at the DUP, they did manage. They came from the periphery and moved in. And similarly, with Sinn Féin, they made that breakthrough. And so now, it's quite okay for a middle-class Catholic up here to vote for Sinn Féin, and they have that confidence. And same, so the two main parties now have come in from the side of the DUP and Sinn Féin, and Sinn Féin are actually doing the same in the south. You'll be very surprised now in the leafy suburbs who are voting for Sinn Féin now, right? Because believe it or not, Mary Lou, who is quite articulate, comes from a solid middle-class background and is appealing to people. So I'd like you to comment on that. Let's see, do you agree with my analysis on that one? And then, Benoit, you mentioned federalism. Now, interestingly enough, when Hughie Smith was there, one of the things I was pushing at the time was that federalism could be very far-reaching for our own peace process here. It could have huge implications. And in fact, remember Hugh Smith saying, yeah, that could work if we had a federal Ireland where you had Munster, Leinster, Connacht and Ulster being part of a federal Ireland. That could be the way forward. But it hasn't happened. One of the reasons it hasn't happened is because we in the Republic have probably the most centralised system of government in Europe. You know, it's become, in fact, it's become more centralised with time. With the new minister coming in now, we have total centralisation of power. So again, do we, you know, within the context of the European Union, can we see a time where we will have that federal for want of a better word, united Ireland, but you know what I mean. A united vision of our islands, you know, and have that real federalism. And is that the way forward for the future?
Well, thank you both. I was fascinated by what you said. I would just like to comment on what John said. I mean, if you're going to talk about federalism in these islands, you're going to have to talk about including Scotland, Wales, and England in that whole shift. And who knows what the future holds? But we have to, in some ways, engage with our ideas of sovereignty. I would say, having been a legislator in the European Parliament, what sovereignty do we have? I mean, I don't think that even in the US you can deal with the levels of corporate power and the interests involved in globalization. And we certainly can't get to grips with climate change except at some other level than the national. So I think there is a true erosion of sovereignty at the nation state level. But people don't realize that. And the reason they don't is because they're so identified with their own communities, which in many cases are national communities. Now, I went to European Parliament exploration of the vote in the recent elections. And there was a panel which included the German ambassador to the Republic of Ireland, who's a person that John and I know well, Dr. Eckhard Luckmeyer. And he stood up and said something which I found rather astonishing. He said, I'm going to get into trouble for saying this, but he said, the vote shows that Europe is a Europe of nation states, and that's the way that Europeans want it. Now, we have to discuss that in the context of what kind of image of sovereignty or nation states do we think we have. I mean, what I would say is that people want their identities recognized and respected. And at some level, the European project, if I can call it that, has not done that. Mm-hmm. And that's what they're bucking against. Yes. But we can only build a true Europe that involves us all if we build on our identities, the existing identities. And that's what you've been saying this morning, John, about here as well. And that's also what you're saying, in a sense, about Belgium. You don't remove the identity and replace it with something else. You have to build on our common problems. How can we solve our common problems together? How can we solve the banking crisis? How can we solve the climate change crisis? And how can we do that respecting people's attachment to language, community, and the symbols of identity? And we are not doing that. We have failed to do that, and we have left it to the right to own those symbols, and I think that's a recipe for disaster.
Yes, on federalism, I'm not for a supranational state, European nation state at all. So I really believe that federalism, the European federalism, must be a mixture of national, regional, and European level. And this is what Ulrich Beck calls the cosmopolitic Europe. And this is difficult to understand, of course. And the problem is, as you say, many politicians are still cultivating the impression that they have the power to. I think France is a fantastic model of this fiction, of this myth, of national sovereignty, of the power of the Republic to change history, and Marine Le Pen is playing on that feeling, and there is a real cultural issue, so an educational issue. To explain that the national governments, yes, they have powers. Yes, the national identities, let's say the Swedish identity, for example, or the Danish identity, they are deeply rooted in hundreds of years of history. So it's nothing that you can scrap in a few decades. It's impossible, and it's not necessary also. But this identity must coexist with European level of solidarity and integrated policies. Yes, maybe.
Yeah. I'd like to respond to John. It's a bit parochial for those of you not from this island. The question on asking why on the unionist side, those who feel themselves to be British and want to remain part of the United Kingdom, we haven't seen the equivalents of their former combatants, military, paramilitaries, terrorists, call them what you will, being included in politics the way that we've seen on the Irish Republican side. And it's a conundrum that I think has many possible explanations. One which I'm not particularly comfortable with, although it has been canvassed certainly by a lot of my colleagues here at university, is to do with the collective experience of Catholicism as opposed to the individualism in the Protestant tradition. That is something to do. I'm not fond of that overly simplistic view, but there may be something in that. Within unionism, there's been a shift from what used to be called big house unionism. This is the official unionist party, to big mouth unionism of the DUP. And the PUP that you mentioned, John, and I think it absolutely has to do with issues of class, is that, you know, I've had, as a local politician, some relations with some of the people who were protesting at the flag last summer. And what clearly came out is a sense that within the loyalist working... In fact, loyalist has now been seen as a way of describing the working class Protestant unionist tradition. That loyalists feel profoundly alienated even from their own political representatives. So there was absolute opprobrium and a lot of anger being projected at those protests and in some of the meetings I had, not against Sinn Féin. They accepted that's what the Shinners are going to do. You know, they say, well, if we were in their position, we'd do the same thing. So there's kind of grudging respect in terms of quite a lot of admiration between opponents, certainly for what Sinn Féin did in terms of the flag issue, but absolute damnation for the DUP. But yes, look at the last election. Where the DUP, once again, its vote slightly decreased, but the loyalist people did not vote for the PUP. Now, there's 3 PUP representatives now on Belfast City Council, but I really struggle, and the only explanation I have is it's got to do with a class experience of the Protestant working class that was built on certainly an unjust distribution of the benefits of Northern Ireland. You know, I think it can be overblown, the levels of discrimination, but it's certainly they were there. The Protestant working class experience was based on whatever you say nothing, vote for our people, and queue up there. You don't need education to get a job. So part of the experience now within loyalism is a deindustrialisation and a culture in which education, for example, was not valued in the same way it was on the nationalist side, because you didn't need an education in the context of Northern Ireland as it was in the past to get a job. All it meant that you were Protestant or Unionist, you joined the queue in the shipyard. So I think that there hasn't been the equivalence of Sinn Féin on the Unionist side, because parties like the DUP are able to play upon the rhetoric of violence and so on. And it's that experience that there's never been the equivalent of Ian Paisley on the Republican side. I mean, again, it's very parochial for those of you not from this island, but it's an important part of the story here, that many of the men, it's very gendered, many of the men who got involved in British loyalist paramilitarism, they were inspired by listening to the rhetoric of Ian Paisley and that type of fundamentalist, ethno-nationalism. I know Peter doesn't like that concept, that sense of loyalty. So for me, it's always been class, maybe the defining issue as to why we haven't seen the likes of David Irvine. And I have to say, if David Irvine had been around, who was a very prominent loyalist politician, the flags protest wouldn't have happened, I don't think. I mean, there's a David Irvine-shaped hole in Northern Irish politics at the moment, which needs to be filled, because there's a lot of growing discontent. And it's partly a complex story of deindustrialisation, a class deference, and particularly for those not from here, we can't underestimate that word loyalty really means a lot here. It's more like fealty. It's almost like a medieval, pre-modern sense of loyalty that many people here feel, not to the British state, I mean, the symbols of Britishness that's often exaggerated here are the King James Bible and the crown on top. And that means it's perfectly possible to challenge Her Majesty's government, as the Ulster Volunteer Force did just before the outbreak of the First World War. They were going to get guns from the Kaiser. So these are prominent British loyalist subjects who are willing to take up arms against Her Majesty's government to stay British. And I think that there's a tradition and a culture perhaps of overdue deference within loyalism, which the Republican side never experienced because they were struggling, and therefore there's a more sense of collective empowerment. So I think that's part of my explanation. It is a class issue, education and so on. There's more people want to get in now, and we're running out of time. But we can go beyond it. Beyond those have to go to the graveyard and be here signed up for it. They need to go now. But before, there's Erica and there's a few other people want to get in. And
yes,
Claire.
I have a question for you, John, but before I say so, I want to, I have to leave very soon, and I just want to thank you all a lot for inviting me here. I learned a lot of things. All I knew about Ireland was what you can read in the papers. To my surprise, I found a lot more in the history and the culture that I could really relate to from my own background. As a religious person, as a political person, and thank you very much, and I hope we'll meet again and find a way to cooperate together. And now for my question. Yesterday, you said, I have the feeling we're back in the 30s in a certain way, or it was maybe Friday that you said that. Could you relate to this, what you said before about democracy being a non-violent way to disagree, and that it diminishes the fear for the other? What does that mean when we talk about populist and xenophobic parties? Do you see them as genuinely democratic? The non-violent ones, because I'm not talking about Golden Dawn and so who are really using violence very openly as a political mean. But parties like the Geert Wilders in the Netherlands and, well, all the others we have all over Europe now, are they not also a way of articulating people's fears, people's way of thinking, and in that way, are they not a genuine contribution to democracy also? Or do you think this is only a mask, and you see that differently? So what about this being in the 30s and your vision on democracy?
Claire?
Coming from Northern Ireland, born and bred, and don't have too much of a connection to the wider European element of it, so I'm going to keep it very local. And I think that being from Northern Ireland, I feel very much we're the orphan of the Isles. I don't think that Ireland and the Irish system particularly wants us or includes us, and I think exactly the same from the British element as well. So we're very often left to flounder on our own, and I say that for many reasons. And we start to look at the shift into a post-conflict society. We have our traumas, we have our history, we have our conflict. Now we're trying to move into this post-conflict society. But again, even the conversations that I'm hearing now, very, very male, very, very overt of the outer structures. What kind of system of governance do we put in place? You know, how do we move? You know, how do the rhetoric suit the people? You know, and we're talking about fears again. When we look at fears, we have to start looking at how we serve justice then. You know, if we have a population living in fear, how do we reconcile with that? And what I don't see happening in Northern Ireland is justice. So we can look at the past, but we're not actually looking at the present. And John mentioned in your opening statement as well about this whole gendered aspect of it. You know, I think that 51% of our population here are female or women. Those women are the majority of people suffering injustice, I feel, and the lack of the will of governments to even implement something like the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 here. They can't even do that because they won't even agree on, was it a conflict, was it a trouble, was it a war? You know, let's ignore it and then we don't have to deal with it. You know, so I think there's a big discussion still to be had with what we're doing right now. Are we allowing the development of a political class, or are we really truly wanting to shift into a post-conflict society and deal with our people?
one more here, and then I'll take Tommy and Dennis.
We didn't plan this, but I already figured out I wanted to thank you as well for opening up this weekend. You've been very generous to me from the Netherlands, opening up during these discussions, but also during dinner, explaining to me and giving me a deeper understanding of what green politics means for social equality and the importance of that. And I learned a lot that I couldn't have learned in the context of the Netherlands and that I could learn here. So thank you very much for being that generous.
Thank you. 1930s, the whiff of fascism, perhaps, democracy, the rise of the far right. I think, I still stand over the view that there are elements of what we're currently experiencing that do have historical echoes of what happened. In terms of these, one view of the rise of the far right is that this is healthy. This is agonism. This are people voting now. You're quite right to draw a distinction between those associated with overt violence like Golden Dawn and just outright xenophobia. And on one level you could say, yes, this is healthy. It's kind of like a cathartic. People are, it's just a protest vote. It's almost like, this is how some of the reporters have been covering the rise of the right. It's just a protest vote. It doesn't mark a shift to the right. I mean, I don't know whether that's actually, the case. But what I would say is that maybe what it questions or it challenges to do is, do we need every political party to sign up to the UN Convention or human rights proof? At the moment we don't. So you can hold racist views, but we do have legislation in terms of hate speech and so on. So we do have ways of at least modifying the expression and the rhetoric and so on. Because my fear would be that although some of these parties are not overtly violent, they are creating the preconditions for violence. And you could get into a much more wide-ranging view, and I would certainly be of this view that violence can also be structural. You can talk about gendered violence, which isn't actually about violence physically against women. It's creating the conditions of injustice. In other words, does violence actually just is another name for injustice in some ways? And that's a challenge then in terms of would that then unnecessarily limit the pluralism and diversity that we want? And again, my non-romantic view of solidarity and community is that we don't always agree. But is it something that we do not tolerate the intolerant? And where parties are creating the conditions for hate speech, for this negative othering of projecting onto whether it's an ethnic...
Who decides where the limits are?
Well, that's ultimately it have to be the ultimate sovereign are the people. I mean, it's one of the difficulties of living in this part of Ireland, this part of the UK. We don't have a written constitution. And without getting overly legalistic, and to go along with one academic that Benoit's mentioned as Ulrich Beck, but another academic is Jürgen Habermas. That we do need, even at the European level, some degree of a constitutional structure, but also within nation states, and that then gives you the basic ground rules for politics.
But
it isn't a complete solution.
Fundamental rights, they are not always.
No, they aren't. No, it's like you have no right not to be offended. You have no right not to be offended, and we have to develop a culture where we're comfortable with occasionally, that's the price we pay for living in a free society, is that occasionally we are offended. Equally, as I always tell my students, that if you look at the UN Charter of Basic Rights, there's no right to consumerism. we may think we have a right, there isn't, and it's about, well, what is a right? And rights conflict. Which is why when rights conflict, you have to have some mechanism, whether it's legalistic or constitutional. So, on the one hand, I think there's a venting, psychological or cultural venting in people voting for far-right populist parties. The real challenge would be at the next round of elections, do we see that going down? It's almost like a tantrum that a teenager might have, or a child. They throw their toys out of the pram and there's an anti-establishment vote, and then people get back and they start voting the way they did before. I'm not too sure whether something has actually shifted. But here's the thing for progressives, we cannot dismiss all of those who voted for far-right populist parties as xenophobic racist, they are raising real issues. Real issues. And I think that the left and Greens, we've often struggled with addressing these really important fears that people have, and therefore it's our challenge is to try and come up with solutions to it. In terms of what Claire has said, yes, I think one way I often describe Northern Ireland in particular is that yes, an orphan child with two patron states, the Republic of Ireland on the one hand and the United Kingdom on the other, and actually one way of looking at Northern Ireland, there is something healthy, again, for those who probably don't know, there's been a growth in the last decade of people who self-identify as Northern Irish, which is a new phenomenon. There's also been a modest return of people from a unionist Protestant background who are comfortable with aspects of their identity being described as Irish. I remember one of my colleagues who's retired now always said that prior to 1968 and the Troubles starting, there was quite a high proportion of Protestant Unionists who described part of their identity as Irish. And one of the things the IRA campaign did was not only the mayhem and the fear and the violence, is that it robbed them of that identity. Because how could they describe themselves apart from as Irish when the Irish Republican Army was actually bombing and killing them? And I think there's been a return, a modest return to that sense of integrating a sense of Irishness into that experience. But equally, I think, reciprocally, there's been a shift the other way of this more hybrid identity of people who see themselves as Irish, as recognising elements of their identity as Anglo or British, and so on. But there is this other question there, and that's the bigger, communal identity. What about gender that's missed out in all of this? And that's a massive issue which we absolutely struggle with in terms of coming up with solutions, even within the party itself. Let's be honest about it. I mean, we struggle within the Green Party to promote and support. So we have it. We're a bit like the Irish football team. We're great on paper, crap on grass.
I have a suggestion for this, because we have the same discussion on gender in all Green parties. In my party, I don't know in the Netherlands, but I think we usually end the discussion with that. And I think we should start the discussion with that point. And this could be a very good issue for another academy.
Absolutely. Well, Tommy, Dennis, and then Peter.
Just again on this whole question of the rise of the right and the extremism in that regard. I mean, I personally dealt with long-term unemployed in my last job. People who are 10 years out of work and from a working class background, and they did have genuine fears, and particularly in the jobs area, where the lower end of the job market, where a lot of immigrants were getting the jobs, and employers, and I know this for a fact, and I've met many employers who would take on immigrants rather than a native Irish person or whatever, because it was cheaper. And I've actually heard one shopkeeper saying, I can take on two Polish people, they work twice as hard and I only pay them half as much as an Irish person. And again, the employers are exploiting them. And the other part of it was, they won't complain, because the wages, a Latvian, for example, was getting 10 times more than they would in Latvia. So employers were exploiting the situation a lot, everywhere really, and the people felt so it's easy for somebody to say, oh, these guys are taking your jobs, and they said, yeah, they are taking their jobs, and they vote for the right-wing racist party, whatever, and it is a genuine fear that is not being addressed, and even the Greens are not addressing it in a serious way anyway. But I think that whole area is something that needs to, the fears, and that's why the UKIP and all of these ones are doing so well. But the other thing I just want to mention is this whole interpretation of sovereignty and federalism. It's often, I think, it means different things to different people, and it's not often Anthony Giddens addressed it the other day, his version of what federalism meant, and it goes with, I think Benoit mentioned it, subsidiarity. We talk about subsidiarity in the Greens, that the decision making at the lowest effective level. What does that mean? Well, obviously we mean, where you can. But as somebody said, and it was John mentioned, we were the most centralised, the South, the Republic of Ireland, the most centralised country in Europe, next to the Soviet Union. The local government has not been changed to the recent act since 1898. The local government have not been changed. The county boundaries are the same since 1898. There's been minor changes, and one or two places, including Greystones, got town commissioner status, the lowest level on the rung of local government, which have since been abolished just recently. So and the Institute of Public Administration published papers 40 years ago showing this centralisation and showing that what needs to be done. So they set up these under the European mandated to set up regional authorities or whatever. And that was a joke. It was the local authorities nominated certain people to be on a regional authority, but it had no effect whatsoever. It's just to comply with the views. And the other aspect of that colonisation, if you like, that's not less, is what I heard one person describe as Coca-Colonisation, where the multinational corporations, giant companies, have more power than governments, in smaller countries anyway, and that this whole consumerism and the way they use advertising and people buy the whole rampant consumerism, which the Greens, of course, are trying to change, is another form of colonisation, and it's been going on for quite some time, but it's not recognised as that has affected sovereignty. Of course, consumerism, the rampant internet has affected sovereignty, and the way that these abuse the countries that the various wherever they're in, they can shift, like Dell have shifted from Ireland to Poland because the neighbour was cheaper or whatever.
I will try to be brief, and I have a question. To get to my question, if I could just start by saying to you, first of all, that appreciate what you've both said. It's been really good. So many things in my mind I can't quite figure out what to ask about, but I do have a question. Just to say, John, you know where I'm coming from when I say that I can see scope for lots of broadly based civic conversations around a lot of issues that have raised this morning, like the gender and politics issue. And I like the idea of doing it at the beginning rather than at the end, because it does tend to be an add-on. But I just want to pick up on a couple of things you said, John, amongst all the other things. And one is, you said a moment ago, ultimately the sovereignty rests with the people. Which, I'm nodding in a way, but I'm also thinking, oh yeah, okay. And I want to connect that with the other reference you made to, I love this notion of the ungenerous majority. And the ungenerous majorities are probably very widespread in all European situations, all democracies. The problem I have is that the ungenerous majority is an ungenerous majority of politicians, elected politicians. And those elected politicians are, certainly in our situation, I suspect very widely elected in a way which does mean that they are not necessarily representative of the majority of the citizens. We have a set of minorities governing us, claiming to be majorities. And my worry is to do with the citizens. We citizens, I'm speaking as a citizen, not a party member, nothing, just a citizen. How on earth, this is the question, how on earth can we who have an interest in politics and the health of our society and the good of the world we live in, encourage a much larger proportion of our fellow citizens to truly engage with the society they live in the politics of a small p, if not a big P. Not just in voting, which is bad enough, that it's ridiculous and it's actually disgusting that 50% plus of people don't vote when that vote was hard won in times past. But it's even more concerning that most of us don't do anything else other than vote. And so I wonder, how can we encourage, how can that participative politics that you've rightly identified as the big issue for democratisation be encouraged, not just here, but anywhere in this world?
Last question, then we'll wrap it up. Peter.
Okay, I wanted to say two things, one about the past, one about the future. One about the past because I'm in Northern Ireland, and one about the future because it'll be about Scotland.
No, future.
Oh, well, no, there's just a habit of talking about the past. I think there's a really interesting dynamic within Protestant Unionist community that was touched on about the relationship between the leadership, the politicians, the clergy, and those who have been employed in the struggle. Let's put it that way. And I think that's actually characteristic of fascist movements right across Europe. There's a way of, and I mean, you see it in the rest of the UK, where you have these street marching, racist groups, like the BNP in the past, the National Front, Combat 18, now Britain First. When we went to protest against Nigel Farage, they threatened to turn up in an armoured personnel carrier. Britain First threatened to turn up in an armoured personnel carrier to take on people protesting against Nigel Farage. And there's always been a relationship between a leadership that eggs on a base and then walks away. Mm-hmm. And that's best characterised by Paisley's paramilitary organisation. And there's that, and you can look it up on YouTube. There's the moment after the signing of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, whatever you want to call it, where Paisley and Dodds and Robinson are expressing their anger about the whole process and being heckled by loyalists. They're like, you led us up the garden path, Mr. Paisley, you led us up the garden path. And I think that's a characteristic, and I think that goes right back to the alignment of Protestantism behind the ruling class as a reaction to the United Irishman uprising in the late 18th century. You have a whole machinery to do that through the Orange Order and through the churches to align the interests of Protestant dissenters with the Anglican establishment. And I think that's what you see characterised in the political organisation now. And you have this very bizarre situation where you have a First Minister who won't talk to terrorists, even though he himself marched across the border into Clontibret and did manoeuvres in the square. I mean, a really bizarre, a divided self there, actually. I think somebody who couldn't decide which side he was on, whether he was the base or whether he was the leadership. He's ended up in the leadership, although I think at one point he might have been the base. And I think there's a really interesting dynamic there that's not reflected on the other side. And you see this in conflict situations around the world. You tend to see those aligned with the dispossessed having much more unity between leadership and base than those who are being controlled, because they're being controlled in the interests of a particular class. And I think that's and you see it in South Africa, you see it in Israel, Palestine. Very much you have a great distance between the leadership and those being told to go and do the killing. The second thing I wanted to say is, as we've talked about before, and Maggie talked about yesterday, we're in the middle of a referendum on independence in Scotland. And I'm fascinated to find that Finicky, which is where my parents live, has more street saltires up, more Scottish flags up on the street than you see in Scotland. Although they've made the same mistake as the Libyans made after the Scottish Freeds, McGrahy, the Lockerbie bomb, where they're not actually the right flag, it's not the right dimensions. Hilariously.
But you have to be Northern Irish to notice that.
I think there's a really interesting dynamic situation coming up with the Scottish independence referendum. And if there's a yes in that referendum, you have a serious rupture in the identity to which unionists align themselves. And I have been quite worried about that in the past. I think actually there may be a huge opportunity there, because I think we may move towards a more complex understanding of what identity means on these islands. Mm-hmm. And if there's no Britain to be part of, if there's no Britain to be a British unionist in, then I think that you may have opportunities that haven't been provided up until now. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something interesting about creating a dynamic that works across these islands rather than one that's about two governments or three governments. And the role of Scotland. I had an interesting meeting with the Deputy First Minister, who will almost inevitably succeed Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon, where she was talking about the relevance of the British-Irish Intergovernmental Council, which is one of those associational mechanisms that was set up as part of the Good Friday Agreement. And it was, I think, really a sop to unionists. There would be north-south institutions to meet nationalist aspirations, but also there would be east-west institutions to strengthen ties with what unionists would call the mainland. Now, I thought it was interesting to see that articulated by somebody from totally outside that process as a way of reconfiguring these islands, which I thought was interesting. And the other interesting thing is, of course, that Nicola Sturgeon has in her constituency Ibrox, and Scottish nationalists, interestingly, in the west of Scotland particularly, are the party of Protestants. Want to break up the union, and there's an interesting contrast.
I just wanted to react on participation and democratic participation and local democracy with two remarks. First remark: in Belgium, the vote is compulsory, so it's it's something that we inherited from the 19th century. Nobody puts that in question anymore today. It's strange. Huh? The second thing is the paradox of local participation inside the Green in Belgium. There is a very strong tradition in Belgium of local democracy. So the municipalities are the base of the Belgian democracy. And it comes from the Middle Age. It's a very old, strong tradition. My father said always that the most important law in Belgium was la loi communale, so the municipal law. It's really the core of our democracy. But there is a paradox in that, because we Greens, we have currently Ecolo has 5 mayors, 1 in Brussels and 4 in Wallonia. And we have, I think, 68 adjunct of the mayors. We have hundreds of local councillors. I don't know the exact amount. We had a severe defeat 2 weeks ago on the regional federal level, and there is a deep crisis in the party, but nobody speaks about the local level, although it's so crucial and so important. So there is a huge paradox there. It's not a paradox, it's a contradiction. And I think we really underestimate the commitment of the activists and of the local councillors, of all the people who are involved in very important decisions for the daily life of the citizens. And it's a pity. And I think instead of discussing, we should of course dedicate some energy to new forms of democracy. I don't contest that, but we should also dedicate much more attention to the local level. And I think this will be probably one of the directions that we will take in the next year's Ecolo.
I think this fits with one of the things that Tommy said, and I speak as a local councillor myself, is that Tommy's correct that in Ireland North and South we have local administration, not local government, centralised, top-heavy, and indeed I think often at times the Green Party's experience has been rather top-heavy as well, having MEPs before we had a healthy crop of grassroots. Here we are, a grassroots movement, one of the foundational principles of Green parties, and yet we had this kind of top-heavy experience. The reason for that, I think, is to do with colonialism. Certainly, you find this in other African states of extractive states are ones that are very top-heavy, often with a very big, strong military and so on. And of course, that then has developed over time. But then, if you take that local level, the other issue you raised, Tommy, was in terms of globalisation. And indeed, many of much of the support, I think, of the far right is in part an anti-globalisation. Now, anti-globalisation, we think of Occupy, kind of left-wing alliance of indigenous people, feminists, environmentalists, and so on. But it's also a right-wing. And in fact, I would say a lot of even radical Islamic politics is in part a reaction against globalisation, as well. And the real issue, though, is how do we, as progressives or Greens, actually attend to people's real fears and not dismiss them as somehow dupes, and that it's all fabricated on the basis. We talk a lot about the media, and I think they should be rightly criticised for giving probably too much of the oxygen of publicity to the far right. But we can't blame everything on the media. There are very real material issues that have to be attended to for people who do support far right parties now. In terms of Dennis's, it's a big issue, and Benoit touched upon it in terms of essentially how do we encourage active citizenship, and particularly for me, I rail against, as somebody who's just come out of an election campaign where my biggest arguments on the doorstep were not against the two UKIP people that I happened to knock on their door with. That was an interesting 2 moments for them, not for me. That it was the people who said, almost in a proud way, I'm not voting. And they were the ones I had most arguments with, and at one point I had to be dragged away. It was near the end of the campaign. I was tired. And I remember saying to one person, they had their son with them at the door, I said, "You are a disgrace, sir. You are an absolute disgrace to tell me with some pride not going to vote." I said, "I don't care who you vote for. Vote for some people dying for your right to vote. We are privileged to live in a free society." And there's a big issue there in terms of alienation, which I think partly feeds into the Farage, populist right-wing, anti-establishment, that the extent that people do vote, they're going to vote for these characters as opposed to what they would see as the mainstream parties. And it's part, to me, had to do with the hollowing out of citizenship progressively over the last 30 years, certainly, where we have reduced citizenship to two things now. One is you're a voter once every couple of years. So that's what citizenship means. You vote every couple of years. And I think Jean-Jacques Rousseau was quite correct in looking across from France to England and saying, well, the English are free every couple of years and they put back on their chains. Because you vote every couple of years and you're free, and then you go back. And that's probably something in there in the loyalist experience as well, where loyalists were, and they often express it, go back into your box now. You're out for the demonstration and do whatever you have to do and back in the box. So that reduction of the citizen to the voter, but equally corrosive, is the reduction of the citizen to a taxpayer, where you enter into this exchange relationship. I mean, some of you may know, one of my first big headlines I got in my local press was a throwaway comment I made at the end of a debate in the chamber, where I agreed with it. It was a unionist proposal. I agreed with it, but I said, listen, could we just call people? I said, I've been in the chamber now a couple of months, and I've noticed we keep calling people ratepayers. I said, can we not call them citizens? Oh my word, then it just all kicked off. I had 24 of my colleagues calling me a Marxist, a radical. I was even called, I was peddling a dangerous French idea. And to all of these I said, I'm a Marxist, yeah, and? Do you know what that means? Probably not, but you're seen as a term of abuse. But it really touched upon, or brought home to me, the sense in which even our elected politicians at the local level have even lost that sense of seeing and being comfortable with the idea we are all fellow citizens. Yes, we do have to pay rates and taxes, and we do vote and so on, but citizenship has become eroded. It's such an anemic sense of what it is that we understand by citizenship. And for me, that's why I'm an enthusiastic supporter of things like basic income, one of the benefits of which is to release people from having to take paid work and so on, where they can actually do other work. This relates to the gender issue as well. We have such a narrow definition of work. Political work is work. Looking after a child is work, not just getting a wage and a salary. And I think that's something that maybe we need to be, Peter McCall's point to us about being more radical and having the courage of our radical conviction, that basic income opens up the prospect of a new democratic culture in which we can actually see that the work we're doing even here today with our sore heads, or some of us, is political work. It's keeping the vibrancy of democracy alive. It's keeping a public space. It's creating a public space. And what we have is that we've reduced that sense of obligation. And I have to say, I do have some affinity I'm a Green Republican, but not in the West Belfast beardy man sense who's now in Louth, a different sense of the proper sense of republicanism, of an obligation you have as a citizen, not just of rights. And there is an issue there where we have a very rights-based, claim-based culture with very few reciprocal obligations. And so it's about how do we, talk about reconfiguring these islands, how do we reconfigure and reboot democracy? And I think it has to start at the local level. I mean, we've just gone through a massive change in Northern Ireland where we've effectively reformed local government. We still have less than half the powers of English councils, but we're considerably more than we had before. But down south, it's a disaster. because it's still that system of centralised administration. In terms of Peter's point, I think you're right in terms of this, the rhetoric by a leadership and then a base, which is then, you kind of punches Pilate, which is what Ian Paisley used to always do. He'd fire young men up with often an anti-Catholic, but certainly an anti-Irish nationalist rhetoric, and then, nothing to do with me. And they did the exact same thing with the flags protest, for those again who are not local. The flags protest started on December the 3rd, 2012. That was the night the decision was made in Belfast City Hall. Preceding that, in the months prior, 40,000 leaflets were distributed in East Belfast by the Democratic Unionist Party and the Ulster Unionist Party, letting people know that the flag is going to be pulled down, this very inflammatory rhetoric. So but they took no responsibility, these parties, that they had anything, we didn't do it, this is, these people causing the riots on the streets, something to do with the fact that we had inflamed them. So that trick is still being used. And actually on the issue of flags, and it kind of wraps up some of the issues we discussed over the last couple of days, to me, the expression of identity, and certainly a sense of British identity often here in Northern Ireland, is born out of insecurity. If you are secure in your identity, you don't have to portray it and constantly, like a megaphone, shout it out all the time. I mean, I've often viewed the exaggerated display, and often of Irishness as well in this part of Ireland, or Britishness. It's rather like a child being in a household who wakes up every day and marches up and down the stairs with a banner saying, I'm a member of this house. But by that very act, they've undermined the sense that they are. Because if you are, you wear it lightly, you assume it. You're secure in your identity, and I think that insecurity is something that we have to attend to as well. But we do have to, I think, go, Stefan.
I just want to add something on the flags and what you said on security and identity. The Flemish movement in Belgium, the Flemish nationalist movement, was very famous for having mass demonstration in the eyes of where the battles of the First World War happened. And until the 80s, it was a real mass protest, and there were a lot of people there. And now it's a really small event. The same, and with less and less people. The same. It means somehow that the federalization of Belgium is on its way. It's nearly finished, so it is not necessary anymore. No, there is no patient anymore. The same is true for what we call the Gordel. The Gordel is a promenade, a bicycle tour around Brussels that was organized by the Flemish people, just in order to show the presence of the Flemish institution around Brussels. And now it's becoming a very sportive and cultural and friendly, even where even francophone, French-speaking are taking part. So so you see, with the time, it's eroding, and it gets peaceful.
Excellent. Folks, I'm going to call it end to the session. So thank you all for staying the course, as it were, to the very end. So we could talk a lot more. And thank you all for your contributions, and thank you for travelling over. So thank you all.
This has been a Join the Cool production for the Green Foundation Ireland. To find out more, visit their website greenfoundationireland.ie.